DIL called me just the babysitter in front of the neighbors. So I removed her name from the $6.20 M deed and sent her a copy of the transfer notice with a note, "Ask your husband. They say a grandmother's love smells like cinnamon, or lavender, or slow-cooked stew. Mine smells like blueberries. Specifically, Charlotte's favorite, blueberry pie, thick and crusty, with just enough tart to make the sweetness sing." That morning, I wrapped the pie in a clean dish towel and carried it out like it was sacred. Because to me, it was. Charlotte loved when I baked. She'd sit on the counter, kicking her little feet and telling me about school, about her books, about how her teacher said she was brilliant for her age. I told her she got that from her grandmother. She thought I meant her other grandmother, Kelsey's mom. I didn't correct her. Paul used to like my baking, too. When he was Charlotte's age, he'd eat the crust before the filling and giggle the whole time. Back when he still had a necktie collection instead of just one blazer hanging behind the door. Back when he still called me Mama instead of Mom. Please, don't. The brunch was supposed to start at 10. It was one of those semi-casual investor mixers Kelsey threw when she wanted to impress tech people into thinking she was more laid back than she was. I'd been told, in no uncertain terms, that it was a private affair. But Charlotte had begged me to make the pie, and Paul had muttered, "I'm sure it's fine if you just stop by and say hi." So I did. When I arrived, they'd already set up the backyard like a luxury vineyard. White parasols, gold-rimmed glasses, a charcuterie board the size of a kayak, and mini toast points stacked with quail eggs and edible flowers. A DJ was playing lo-fi ambient music I couldn't tell from static. Everyone was under 45 and wore sunglasses that cost more than my car. I walked to the sliding glass doors, clutching the pie. The moment I stepped into the yard, Kelsey's assistant spotted me and froze. A young man in a dusty rose linen shirt leaned toward her and whispered something, probably, "Who's the old lady with the covered dish?" Kelsey saw me from across the garden and made a beeline, her face pinched in a way that made my stomach ache. "Oh," she said with a tight smile, "you brought food." "Just Charlotte's favorite pie." I thought, "That's sweet," she cut in. "But this isn't a bake sale, Agnes." Several heads turned, someone laughed, soft but sharp enough to feel like a sting. I looked at Paul, who stood near the mimosa table. He glanced away, fast. "I wasn't trying to intrude," I said, my voice calm. A woman in a silk pantsuit stepped forward and asked, "Oh, is this your chef?" Before I could answer, Kelsey chirped, "She just lives here, keeps the Wi-Fi warm, babysits when needed." That got a louder laugh. One man sipped his drink and said, "Every founder needs support staff." I could feel my cheeks heat. The pie felt heavier. If you've ever held a peace offering, only to be mocked, gone silent when your home was used to shame you, smash that hype button. Let's amplify the quiet strength of every grandmother who built her world before anyone realized she wasn't just background noise. Charlotte came running from the garden maze, barefoot and laughing. She threw her arms around my waist. "Grandma!" I held her tight. Kelsey yanked her daughter's arm with a forced laugh. "Sweetie, we talked about boundaries. Too much attachment makes kids regress." Charlotte blinked, confused. I bent down and whispered, "It's all right, love. You go play." Kelsey took the pie from my hands like it was trash, then looked back at her assistant. "Can you, find somewhere out of sight for this?" It was then that I knew, not just suspected, knew. I wasn't family. Not to her, not in her home. Not in this space I partially paid for, slept in, baked in. I was just the babysitter. And that's when I reached into the lining of my cardigan pocket, pulled out a discreet key fob the size of a lipstick tube, and pressed the recessed button with my thumb. To anyone watching, it just looked like I was fiddling with my sweater. To the blockchain system I'd programmed months earlier, just in case, it was a command. Trigger phrase detected, just the babysitter. Cross-residence, primary residence. Condition, elder humiliation in public setting. Result, activate smart deed reallocation protocol. The entire house, legally speaking, was about to shift. I left the backyard without another word. Behind me, the music swelled, and somewhere, in a quiet vault of automated legal infrastructure, a name began to disappear from the deed. It wasn't mine. People think fading from the spotlight happens all at once. It doesn't. It's not a curtain drop. It's slow erosion. You go from indispensable to available, from visionary to out of touch, from Agnes Bartlett, founding partner, to Paul's mom. You fade one syllable at a time. Long before Kelsey called me just the babysitter, I'd already been erased. Not with malice, not even with awareness. Just convenience. But let me take you back. I was 48 when I left the boardroom. I'd built and run one of the most reliable angel syndicates in Nevada. 7 companies we funded went to Series B, 3 were acquired, and one, well, that one was the seedling Kelsey thought she'd built alone. She was still in grad school when she cold emailed a firm I owned through a holding company. I remember the subject line: Reimagining Home Ownership for the Modern Millennial. The deck was a mess, buzzwords swimming in pink fonts, slogans like real estate meets feminine intuition, and charts with no sources. But something about it caught me. Not the idea, her voice. There was fire in it under all that fluff. So I called the team. Give this one a look, I said. She's either delusional or brilliant, possibly both. Let's find out. They laughed. I signed the check. I used one of our blind arms Nevada 23 holdings. Standard practice. Founder never sees who's behind the capital unless it's strategic. I didn't want her to know it was me. Back then, she was just dating Paul. I wasn't trying to flex power or influence her. I just wanted her to succeed, on her own terms. I knew how it felt to be seen as a woman getting help from a man's world, so I offered help from the shadows. The investment paid off. Within 2 years, Kelsey's platform was closing pre-seed rounds in Denver, Austin, and Seattle. Women were buying and co-owning homes together without waiting for husbands or brokers. It was messy in execution, but powerful in impact. She became a darling on the podcast circuit. I became a ghost. One day, she said to Paul at dinner while stirring her wine with a metal straw, "Whoever helped me that first year? Nevada 23 Holdings? They were the only smart person in that generation. Everyone else tried to control me." Paul nodded. "You ever meet them?" She shrugged. "No, which is probably why it worked. They kept their dusty ideas out of my way." Dusty. I smiled politely. She didn't know she was drinking that wine in a house partially purchased with her own funding check. She didn't know the legal clause she'd signed gave controlling interest to the trust I managed. She didn't know the kitchen she redesigned had tiles I picked out 20 years ago with Paul's father, before he got sick, before he passed, before our home became a house for other people. She didn't know. Or maybe she chose not to. The longer I stayed, the more invisible I became. I was no longer former investor. I was helpful with Charlotte. No one asked how the mortgage got approved. No one asked why the solar panels had my maiden name on the manufacturer's invoice. No one asked why the electric bill never came in their names. Paul never wondered either. He always assumed the trust his father left covered our living costs. He never read the appendices, never asked who restructured the holdings after the 2008 crash, never asked who taught the family accountant how to handle cryptocurrency diversification. He thought it was luck. It's funny, the smarter your children get, the less they want to believe you taught them anything. But I wasn't bitter, not then. Back in 2020, when the pandemic hit, I offered to handle some of Kelsey's back-end financials while her company pivoted to virtual home tours. I did it under a new alias, Gray + Finch Consulting. Just a few emails, nothing that would tip her off. When the numbers stabilized, she posted on LinkedIn. Huge shout out to our anonymous advisory angel, Gray + Finch, who helped us weather the storm. Whoever you are, you're a damn genius. That made me smile. For a moment I felt seen, even if only by accident. But it never lasted. By 2022, I was no longer consulting, baking, or even invited to quarterly reviews. I was full-time furniture the day I overheard her telling Charlotte, "We don't bother Grandma with grown-up things." Something shifted. Not anger, not yet. More like a slow, sad detachment. The kind that creeps in when someone thanks everyone but you in their TED Talk and you still clap. But I never stopped documenting. Every investment, every holding, every transfer. I had paper trails longer than her company's code base. I'd once read a quote in an old finance manual. "Power isn't what you own, it's what no one knows you control." So I smiled when I heard her call me just the babysitter. Because that is an insult? That phrase? It wasn't just mean, it was activating. Literally, inside the family trust, buried under hundreds of digital clauses, was a conditional smart contract, signed, time-stamped, and waiting, the Elder Disrespect Protocol. It had very clear triggers. If any co-occupant of the property uses any of the following phrases in a public setting, within earshot of unrelated persons, while referring to Agnes Bartlett, just the babysitter, irrelevant, senile, the help, then the deed would initiate a temporary ownership freeze, reroute controlling interest to a successor trustee, and notify relevant parties of breach of fiduciary morality. Fancy words for, you humiliate me, you lose the keys. But I hadn't written it out of spite. I wrote it because silence, I've learned, only protects the loud, and I'd been silent for too long. There's a quiet humiliation in needing permission to run a dishwasher in your own home. A humiliation so subtle, most wouldn't notice it at all. But when you've signed the check that paid for the kitchen renovation, you notice. It started with the schedule. Kelsey had installed some kind of efficiency software that turned the house into a color-coded grid. Each resident got an account on her smart home app. Charlotte, Paul, even the cleaning lady who came on Thursdays. I was the only one not given a login. At first, I thought it was an oversight. But when I tried to use the washing machine one morning, Kelsey emerged from the hallway like she'd caught me stealing something. "Oh," she said, pausing at the laundry room door. "You didn't reserve this time block." "Reserve? Yeah. We use a shared calendar. Paul should have told you." "He didn't," I replied. She crossed her arms. "Well, I mean, it's kind of how the house works. Like a startup, everyone has their function. Yours is comfort, not control." "Comfort? Not control." I looked at the pile of Charlotte's uniforms in my arms, ones I had folded, ironed, and repaired more times than I could count. I looked at the washer, gleaming white, smart enough to send an email, but apparently too smart for me to use without a digital pass. I nodded. "All right," I said. "I'll wait." Later that week, I found my name printed in lowercase letters on a piece of masking tape, stuck to a plastic bin in the fridge. Agnes Almond Milk. Like, I was the intern on a diet. I didn't say anything. Instead, I started labeling things too. My investments, my grants, the documents that still bore my signature, all in capital letters. The room I slept in had once been a storage closet. They'd cleared it out when I moved in after the surgery. "Just until you recover," Paul had said. "A couple months at most." That was 4 years ago. The walls still bore faint lines from the shelving units that used to stand there. A few screws were still wedged in the corners. There was no window, just a small vent that whirred like a dying fan. When Charlotte asked if she could sleep in my room one night, Kelsey said no. "Sweetie, it's not really a bedroom. It's a transitional space." Like I was a ghost passing through. I didn't argue. I just started keeping a flashlight under my pillow because the motion sensor lights didn't reach that far down the hallway. I learned which floorboards creaked, which kitchen cabinets I could open without waking the algorithm, which walls were thin enough to hear what they really said about me. Paul, when I brought it up, just sighed. "It's just temporary, Mom. You know how intense she can be under pressure." I used to believe that it was pressure, that if I waited long enough Kelsey would soften, Paul would remember, and I'd be allowed to exist without permission slips. But I wasn't waiting anymore, because pressure doesn't erase people. Power does, and Kelsey had power. Not just the loud CEO kind, but the quiet kind that rewrites reality. She knew how to smile at guests and shame me in private, how to make my presence look like privilege and my dignity look like drama. She once joked, at brunch, that I ran the guest suite like a retirement bunker. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But later that night, when I tried to turn on the ceiling fan, it told me my access had expired. I asked Paul if he could reset it. He said, "Babe handles the smart stuff. I don't really mess with it." The word babe hit harder than I expected. That's what he used to call me when he was 4, unable to pronounce mommy. Now, I was the woman asking babe for permission to breathe. So I learned to stop asking. Instead, I wrote, "In the mornings, before the house stirred, I'd sit by the back window with my legal pad and document everything. October 4th, lock reset. No explanation. October 6th, Kelsey called me off-brand Mary Poppins in front of her coworker. October 9th, Found old family photos deleted from digital frame. You see, when someone starts erasing you from the house, they don't start with the deed. They start with the calendar, the closet space, the Wi-Fi password. They start with your name. But I still had mine, and soon they'd remember exactly what that name still owned. The truth is, I didn't even like blockchain when it first came out. Too many bros, too much jargon, and too much noise about decentralizing power from people who'd never lived without it. But years ago, when Paul was still working in mid-level real estate and sweating through interest-only loans, I saw what was coming, not just in tech, but in people. I saw how quietly leverage changed hands, how quickly gratitude morphed into arrogance. And I decided that if they ever forgot who I was, I'd leave behind a mechanism that would remind them, legally, elegantly, irrevocably. Paul was broke when they bought this house. Not things are tight broke. I mean the kind of broke where banks don't return your calls and closing costs become fantasy. He came to me with downcast eyes asking for a short-term float. I didn't blink. I gave him enough to secure the home, paid through a silent trust called Estuary 8, masked under a fiduciary partnership I co-owned from a Nevada entity formed in 1999. My name never appeared in the transaction, but I controlled 70% of the house from the day the ink dried. I didn't tell Paul, and certainly not Kelsey. I wanted them to build their life without feeling tethered. It was my late husband's dream that Paul would feel free, even if we helped from behind the curtain. But I knew better than to trust good intentions alone. So I built in a clause. Deep inside the smart contract that governed the trust, a trigger protocol could be activated under very specific conditions. It wasn't vindictive, it was protective. The clause was simple. If Agnes Bartlett, primary originator, is publicly belittled by any co-occupant, especially using demeaning labels relating to her role, presence, or relevance, and if said statement is verifiably recorded in audio/video form within range of non-familial third parties, then control of the primary asset shall transfer to successor beneficiary C. Bartlett via a custodial entity Agnes controls, simultaneously freezing all modification privileges from current listed parties. It was airtight, drafted by my most trusted lawyer, signed digitally, notarized, and stored in multiple immutable ledgers. And for 5 years, it sat quietly, gathering digital dust, until brunch, when Kelsey called me, just the babysitter, in front of 5 investors and a microphone hidden near the DJ booth. She didn't just bruise my pride, she pulled the trigger. Within 2 minutes of my button press, the system began its chain reaction. Contract activated, audio match confirmed, witness count 6, successor reallocation in process. By the time I was halfway down the block, her phone buzzed with a notification she wouldn't recognize. But her lawyer would. Later that afternoon, tucked inside her inbox between a Peloton promo and a skincare PR inquiry, was this. From Merriman & Lott, LLP. Subject. Asset reallocation trigger. Immediate attention required. Per your recorded statement at 11:47 a.m., during the event held at 318 South Wickham, conditions for the trust reallocation trigger have been satisfied. As outlined in Exhibit 4.6A of the Housing Trust, filed under Estuary 8, control of the deed has been temporarily suspended from you and Mr. Bartlett and reassigned to successor trustee Charlotte Bartlett under legal custodianship. Please refrain from any attempts to sell, refinance, or alter property terms. All title access is now re-only, pending further review. Kelsey didn't scream, she performed. First, she tried to charm her lawyer, assuming it was a mistake. Then she blamed a data error. Then she turned on Paul, demanding answers, but Paul didn't have any, because he never read the fine print. He never knew who Estuary 8 really was. That evening he came to my room. Not to apologize, to panic. Mom, there's some mix-up with the deed. Kelsey says we're locked out of our equity. Not a mix-up, I said. A trigger. He blinked. A what? I opened the small lockbox at the foot of my bed and handed him a manila folder. Inside were the original clauses, the terms, the notarized signatures, including his, which he signed without reading, when I refinanced the roof 3 years ago. He scanned the pages, eyes growing wider. You wrote this? No, I architected it. It was reviewed by 2 attorneys and a retired federal mediator. He looked up, betrayed. Why would you do that? Because I knew one day I might need protection, and you wouldn't give it to me. He sat down, stunned. You put the house in Charlotte's name? Not directly, through a custodian. She's too young to hold title, but I'm the custodian for now. You can't just do that. I can. I did. You signed off. He rubbed his forehead. Kelsey's gonna flip. She already did. I didn't say it with malice, just certainty. I didn't raise my voice or cry or beg him to understand, because this wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about facts, ownership, boundaries, and the hard truth was, you cannot erase someone from the walls they built and expect them to stay silent forever. So now, Kelsey was no longer a co-owner. Paul no longer had full say, and the house they mocked me in was now under my law, my key, and Charlotte's future. The pie, after all, was just a signal, but the recipe? That was always mine. It started with the email. No explosion, no confrontation, just a polite, devastating subject line. Urgent, operating account frozen pending ethics review. Kelsey stared at it for 5 full minutes before clicking. The message came from one of her angel investors, a sustainability fund out of Portland with strict ESG policies. The clause they cited was obscure but unambiguous. If any stakeholder or direct party to company-owned or personal assets held under executive leadership is found in breach of dignity, equity, or moral treatment of vulnerable persons, including elders, dependents, or tenants, operational funds may be suspended until compliance is restored. It sounded like fluff, until the money stopped moving. That very morning, 2 of her assistant managers had tried to draw on the fund to secure venue deposits for upcoming investor galas. Declined. Her bank rep didn't return her call for 3 hours. When he finally did, his tone was clipped. Ms. Bartlett, your accounts are being reviewed for possible breach of internal investment policies. We're not authorized to provide clearance until legal clarifications are made. Her face drained. She paced the living room like a woman being hunted, clutching her phone, calling contacts, pulling up contracts. Anything to prove this was a glitch, but it wasn't. It was the crust. Flaky. She'd laughed at that pie, thrown it out like compost, but what she didn't realize was that beneath the crust, the foundation was rock solid. Because the house, the one she'd built her brand around, was no longer fully hers, and her brand depended on ethical leadership. See, several of her clients were in the impact investing space, people who prided themselves on uplifting women, elders, marginalized folks, the kind who quoted Maya Angelou on Zoom calls. Once word got out, once someone mentioned that she'd mocked her mother-in-law at a public event, who then triggered a reallocation clause that legally froze her real estate stake, it was over. Not a scandal. Worse, a liability risk. Within 72 hours, she was removed from signing authority on 3 deals, 2 of them multi-million-dollar co-investments. Her board said it was temporary, but the tone said otherwise. Kelsey screamed into a towel. Meanwhile, I was at the park with Charlotte. She was reading from her tablet while I crocheted beside her. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to, because at that moment, Paul was finally starting to understand. He'd come into the kitchen the night before looking like he hadn't slept. "Mom," he began, almost gently, Did you know this might happen?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I planned for the possibility," I said. He sat down. "She's unraveling. She built a brand on image," I said, "and forgot that image starts at home." He didn't argue. He just stared at the counter, the same counter I'd paid for in 2017 when they couldn't afford quartz, and said, "I thought you were losing it. I really did. All those notebooks, the post-its, the way you talk to the smart speakers." I smiled. "Sometimes talking to the walls is the only way to make them listen." He rubbed his temples. "She'll never forgive you." I placed a folded note on the table in front of him, the same one I'd tucked under the blueberry pie. He opened it. The crust was flaky, but the foundation? Rock solid. He read it twice, then said nothing, because by now he knew the truth. I was never losing control. I was reclaiming it, silently, strategically, with the same precision I once used to negotiate equity splits across 4 continents. They thought I was past my prime, but they forgot some of us are silent, not because we're weak, but because we're calculating. And Kelsey? She had just learned the cost of underestimating someone who built the floor she stands on. The invitation was addressed to me, officially. Agnes Bartlett, primary stakeholder, Estrie 8 Holdings. For years, the quarterly investor board meetings had been Kelsey's stage. Her slides, her slogans, her starched blazers with ironic sneakers. She stood beneath LED lights and buzzword banners, selling empowerment like bottled air. But this time, they weren't clapping for her. This time, they were clapping for me. I walked into the conference room in soft navy wool, no makeup, hair in a simple knot. I didn't need to impress them. I already owned the room. When the board chair saw me, he stood. "Mrs. Bartlett," he said, extending a hand. "An honor." "Just Agnes," I replied, "but thank you." Kelsey was already seated, half shocked, half pretending it was all some scheduling mix-up. She stood when I approached, smile, trembling. "What? What are you doing here?" I handed her a copy of the trust document. Page 14 was highlighted. In any instance where the primary stakeholder is reactivated, all voting rights and representation revert immediately to said stakeholder. Her eyes skimmed the page like she'd never seen words before. "You're not seriously going to—" "I am," I said. "Let's not keep the board waiting." We sat. The meeting began. The agenda was supposed to include a presentation on Q3 property expansions, but after a motion from the chair, the floor was yielded to me. I rose. No slides, no gimmicks, just my voice. "They say women fade after 60, I began. "But some of us, we just go stealth." The room went still. We raise children, we build homes, we open doors for people who forget we held the keys, and when the world tells us we're just something, just the wife, just the babysitter, just the relic in the guest room, we smile, we listen, and sometimes we press a button. Someone chuckled. I didn't. Let me be clear. This isn't vengeance, it's visibility. I am not here to make a scene. I am here to reclaim my seat. And with that, I sat down. The applause wasn't loud. It was solid. The kind of applause that says, we saw, we understood, we underestimated. Kelsey, beside me, was frozen, and then, like a dam breaking, she snapped. "You embarrassed me," she hissed, her voice too sharp for the room. The chair cleared his throat. "Mr. Bartlett, please, you humiliated me," she went on, eyes wide. "I built this. I built all of this," I turned to her, calm as ever. "You erased me," I said. "I simply turned on the light." She stood up too fast, knocking over her metal water bottle. It clanged against the table. Her eyes filled with tears, but no one comforted her. Not because they hated her, but because they realized she was never the only architect, and I had always been the blueprint. She wanted it back. Of course she did. The equity, the image, the access. Not because she understood what she'd done, but because being on the outside of something she thought she owned felt like death to her. So when Kelsey requested a meeting, I agreed. We sat in a neutral co-working space downtown, glass walls all around, like some parody of transparency. She wore her media-safe look. Ivory blazer, tiny mic pinned inside the lapel, lips matte and expression tight. Paul came too, but he didn't say much. "I just want things to go back to normal," she said, hands folded, voice steady. "We've all made mistakes." "Normal?" I said. "Like when I needed permission to do my laundry?" She winced. "That was exaggerated." "It wasn't, but let's not litigate tone. You want back in." She nodded. I pulled out a slim folder. Inside was an amendment to the custodial transfer, a clause to restore partial ownership. "But there's a condition," I said. Her jaw tensed. "You will deliver a public apology," I continued, "at the next Women in Legacy Leadership Charity Gala. On stage, microphone on, minimum 60 seconds. No lawyers, no euphemisms." She stared at me. "You want to humiliate me?" "I want to humanize what you erased." She didn't answer, just reached for the folder and began flipping pages. A week later, the email went out. "Special address by Kelsey Bartlett, co-founder of Bartlett Futures, with a tribute to intergenerational mentorship and women's financial resilience." They dressed it up nice, but we both knew what it was. The night of the gala, I wore navy again. It felt lucky. I stood in the back of the ballroom as Kelsey took the stage, cheeks a little pink, jaw tight with pride and surrender. She looked out over the crowd of 500 women, executives, founders, mothers, daughters, and began, "There was a time I called my mother-in-law just the babysitter." I said it with a smile, not realizing that sometimes a smile can be a weapon. Turns out, she wasn't just the babysitter. She was the architect of my home, the mentor I never knew I had, and the founder of the very floor I built my career on. A pause. A silence so thick it held its breath. "Agnes Bartlett, thank you. I am sorry, and I will never forget you again." The applause was real. Not for her, for what had been acknowledged. Later that month, I finalized the split. Paul and Kelsey regained partial ownership, just enough to function, not enough to override. I retained custodial authority for Charlotte's future. But I wasn't done yet. I took every cent of back rent they now owed me, yes, they were paying rent on their own house, and funneled it into something I'd been dreaming about for years. A scholarship fund. Not for Ivy League teenagers, not for influencers or app developers, for women over 50. Women who were told it was too late, who were called behind the times, who were just babysitters. The Agnes Fund launched 3 months later with an inaugural class of 22 women, all of them learning blockchain literacy, smart contracts, and financial protection strategies. I sat in on the first Zoom. One woman, a former nurse, said, "I never thought someone like me could understand crypto, but I guess if Agnes can burn her son's house down with a button, I can learn a wallet app." We all laughed. But they got it, because legacy isn't about who claps for you on stage. It's about who still stands when the lights go off. And I was still standing. 6 months later, they were paying rent on their own house. To me, technically to the trust, Estrie 8, but everyone knew who controlled the ledger now. The market had gone up, and since they needed the property for stability, they agreed to a new rate, twice their original mortgage. Paul called it short-term restructuring. I called it accountability. They moved back in with fewer suitcases, fewer assumptions, and a whole lot more silence. Charlotte, however, had grown. She now had a room with a door that actually closed, no longer the converted office Kelsey had forced on her. A real desk, a real computer, and a starter portfolio I co-managed through a financial custodial account in her name. She called it my not-so-secret piggy bank. I visited every Sunday, not as a resident, as a landlord. At first, it made Paul twitch. He tried to act like it was all normal, offered me tea, small talk, but Kelsey, she couldn't hide it. The first time I rang the doorbell after the lease was signed, she opened the door and just stood there. Not with contempt, with fear. Not of me, but of what I represented. The fact that the woman she mocked had become the woman she paid. I stepped inside. "Rent's due," I said, handing her the invoice. "And tell Charlotte next time she can add the blueberries herself." Kelsey blinked, then nodded. It was our first unspoken truce. Later, as she was sweeping the porch, no longer barking at the gardener, no longer ordering me to stay out of the smart home zones, I stepped beside her. "The Wi-Fi," I said quietly. "The one you joked I kept warm?" She paused. I smiled. "Still warm. Still mine." She didn't reply, but I saw the smallest, strangest curve tug at her lips. Not anger, not shame. Maybe, just maybe, respect. Because I hadn't screamed. I hadn't slammed doors. I hadn't even raised my voice. I'd just waited, watched, prepared, and when the time came, I pressed the right keys on a system I built years ago, quietly rewriting the story they tried to delete me from. Charlotte now visits my place every Friday. We bake, talk crypto, and laugh about code names. She asked me once, "Grandma, do you feel better now that you won?" I told her, "I didn't win, sweetie. I just remembered who I was." And that was enough. Charlotte was 10 when she asked the question, "Grandma, when you're gone, what happens to the house?" I was slicing apples for a pie, not blueberries this time, too obvious. I paused mid-cut, looked at her soft face, the same tilt of chin Paul had, the same sharp eyes I once carried before the world softened them. "Well," I said, "that depends on whether the people in the house remember who built it." She blinked. "You did?" I smiled. "Not just me. It took a few people, and a lot of lessons." She frowned. "Like the pie?" "Exactly like the pie. Charlotte was different. She always had been. She listened in full sentences. When she asked questions, they weren't just curiosity, they were blueprints. She didn't want answers, she wanted systems. So I showed her, not just how to make crust, how to protect legacy, how to run a trust, how to manage custodial powers, how to set fail-safes with biometric locks, how to write contracts with dignity clauses, how to never raise your voice, only your ownership. We called it legacy mode, not a game, a protocol. It started with small things. Her allowance was routed through a mini-trust with milestones. Her tablet on a contract. Her school fund is embedded with anti-interference terms. No one could touch it. Not even Paul, and as she grew, so did her questions. One day she asked me, "Why didn't you just sell the house and leave?" I looked at her. Because leaving isn't always victory. Sometimes staying is the final chapter. I wasn't here to ruin Paul or Kelsey. They were already running their own silent losses. Paul now worked under a junior title at a firm where no one knew his last name, carried weight once. And Kelsey, she pivoted to something she called digital mentorship for women, but no investor touched her. It turns out humiliation doesn't age out of search engines. But me, I was investing. Quietly. I bought back shares from 2 former business partners. I helped a janitor at Charlotte's school start her own cleaning franchise. I even helped my friend Carla, who'd been evicted by her own daughter, write a housing clause that left her family gasping when they realized they couldn't enter her second condo without her biometric code. "I wish I was as smart as you," Carla said once, laughing. "You are," I said. "You just didn't weaponize it yet." Then came the final letter. I'd drafted it years ago, but now it was real. A legacy clause. It stated that upon my passing, Charlotte would inherit everything, not just the house, but the trust, the IP, the smart contract system, and my entire digital asset vault. She would be the new guardian of what I'd started. But only if, and this was the key, she passed 3 gates. She must teach another woman over 50 how to protect her own assets. She must forgive someone who erased her, publicly, and without demand for apology. She must lose something, and recover it without using money. Why? Because legacy isn't something you hold, it's something you grow through pain. I buried the clause in a cold wallet, a hardware key. It would activate through her voice, not her signature. I trained the AI model on her first 500 spoken phrases. It would know her tone, her tremble, her truth. One night, I handed her the tiny metal device. "What is it?" she asked. "A recipe," I said. "For what?" "For the day you forget how powerful you really are." She held it in her palm, like a secret the stars sent down. Then hugged me, the kind of hug where nothing is said, because everything is known. That night, Paul came by. "I saw the fund," he said, "the one you named after me." "I didn't name it after you," he blinked. "It's called the Bartlett Seed Fund." "That's not your name alone." He hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry, Mom." For the first time, I believed him, not because he sounded sincere, because he looked tired, the kind of tired that only comes when denial finally gives way to clarity. "I know," I said. "You always planned this, didn't you?" "No," I said. "I planned for if you failed." He nodded. I didn't need vengeance anymore. I had infrastructure. Weeks passed, the house softened. Kelsey stopped correcting Charlotte at dinner. Paul refilled the bird feeder without being asked. And me? I sat by the window, crocheting blockchain phrases into pillows no one understood but Charlotte. Then came the knock. A woman, mid-60s, blazer frayed, eyes burning with betrayal. "My son just stole my annuity," she said, holding the flyer from the Agnes Fund. "Is this real?" I stood, offered her tea, sat her down, and said, "Let's bake a new foundation." And that's how I reclaimed my place. Not with fists, not with fury, but with foresight, dignity, and a well-timed clause. So the next time someone calls you just the babysitter, just the old lady, or just background noise, remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room owns the deed. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, where we tell the truths that were once whispered, the revenge that came slow but sure, and the wisdom they never saw coming. Because revenge doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just smiles and hands over the invoice. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.